what sort of drew you to the project? And the second part of it is, what do you feel the power of this show is?
There's a part of me that is so much this character in his dilemma of carrying such deep DNA Japanese, and it's specifically very Japanese, commitment to truth. And that's what I really appreciate, like I said, about New York. The honor, the intelligence. It's intelligence to be for peace. It just absolutely is. And anything that is not that nature really just leads us further and further into natural animal instincts, which don't require any thinking. And we're kind of moving in that direction, not only militarily, but into this millennial next step. Less and less thinking, just keep nodding your head. That's dangerous. That's dangerous. That's dangerous and a result of a society who won the war. So to turn the tables, all of a sudden, the mind just flips over. Anyway, it will make a millennial stop and think, what are you talking about? and that's what I think is critical for the world today. We need to be considering thinking and looking at each other as mutual souls and spirits that live in this place together. There's no way out of this mess unless it's total annihilation or totally coming together. And this character, the thing that drew me to him, certainly, is the closeness to the kind of dilemma that I went through growing up. I was born in Tokyo. Mother's side of the family was all Imperial Japanese Navy. And her father was Secretary of Architecture for the Imperial government. So can't get any more Japanese than that kind of commitment. And on my father's side from Hawaii, all just local boys, and actually the home of the most decorated military group in the history of the United States, the 442 and 100th Battalion. They were so small that they were considered 4F. They just cut up the uniform. They made them roll up their pants. They were so small, but they became the most decorated unit in the history of the military. So they had the warrior spirit of being Japanese. So I had this split going on, U.S. Army, Imperial Japanese Navy. And I was raised in the U.S. Army. Not only was I raised in the U.S. Army, but I was raised in the South, in Louisiana, Texas, and North Carolina. So it's almost like a spirit chose an environment to create nothing but challenge and to work my way through this paper bag at 6 years old, come up with a solution. And ultimately, what I came to, once I recognized the scope of the problem, come on, the South can't beat them. Okay, well, what are we going to do? Are we going to roll over and die? No. Are we going to fight? Could, but it just is a continuous thing. Once you start fighting, there'll always be somebody else. There'll be his friend, his brother, and you always have to kind of be looking over. It's like I knew that wasn't how all these questions were even questions for a 6-year-old. I don't know. But ultimately, I came up with a third solution, which was to beat them at their own game and to lead, be the leader, thrive on this thing. And that's what I did. I observed, saw what the situation was, and where all 6-year-olds are embarrassed, don't want to be in some sort of embarrassing situation by having the wrong answer when the teacher asks a question. Nobody was raising their hand. And I'm thinking, okay. So then I started raising my hand. Had the distinction of like having the wrong answer continually. But it got them, it shook them up to think, who is this guy? We don't like him now. What is his problem? Why would he keep making a fool of himself? And pretty soon I was the class leader. No, it was
You were
the
class what? I'm sorry.
leader.
Oh, leader. Okay.
I became the MC for the Christmas program. And that's where Donald Trump is right now. The failures lead to your success. Any guy who's successful has never had failure, headed for a big fall. And it doesn't widen your perspective. You don't have to think anything but yourself. And I think for this generation, it's a good time to understand there's more than just us and our Twitter page. So I'm very excited by the material. And the ability to bring something to the character where a lot of maybe Asian actors in Hollywood wouldn't even begin to understand the dilemma.
As a military kid myself, I have always noticed that military kids either become leaders or they shrink into the background because there are no other options for you because you move around so much. And I was wondering, what are some of your characters' motivations in working in, occupied California?
Definitely is about peace and a very military perspective. He's from a naval background, highly intelligent, highly diplomatic, knows how to deal with things. In seeking a position of parity with Germany, who the Japanese are expecting they have because we're allies, but in fact the Germans have their own agenda. And so Tagawa is very clear about that dilemma and seeks to create parity with that. And it's what I did in my life, so it's very much close to me.
The characters kind of feel, even though you won, still there's a desperation that's building, isn't there?
That's one thing that I think we have a grave mistake about. Success is not always ultimately success. Mm-hmm. There's so much that comes with success that unless you're aware of the movement of energy, which sounds pretty new agey kind of West Coast BS, you don't have much of a future. And that's the beauty of this character and the beauty of the writer who injected this book called the I Ching. You're familiar with the I Ching? The Book of Changes? That is like a 4,000-year-old book, 5,000-year-old book. And we're not talking about 500 years or 1,200 years. We're talking about 5,000. The Chinese, and that's why we better start to understand more about the Chinese here before we move much further, because there's a great possibility of totally just being overrun. But you got to understand, they have a lot more knowledge about energy and movement of energy. And this book is basically a computer. Each one of those symbols are a program. There's 64 hexagrams. And that was one of the first things when I was introduced to it that I thought, this is an ancient computer. And then found out when I was researching this story, the German who translated the I Ching to English was the one that came up with the concept of a binary system for the computer. Wilhelm Baines. So there's a magic, you don't have to always be number one. It's a tough place to be. I'd rather be number three. Let number two and number one fight it out to figure out which ego is more important. But number three will actually be the balancing point. All you got to do is throw you one way or the other. But stand back and wait when you see this kind of power, dilemma going on, because we're really coming into the point in our society, in the society of the world, where power ain't gonna work. Muscle politics mentality ain't gonna work. Doesn't matter how many stealth bombers you got. They'll take you out on the ground And they've been fighting for a lot longer than we've even been around. Come on, 1,000 years of fighting in the hills when they were throwing rocks at helicopters, but throwing them in exactly the right place, and that helicopter is going down. That's where technology is not going to work for us. And the story, it's true. The Germans have all the technology. The Japanese have the spiritual technology. And Tagomi's kind of stuck right in the middle. How to deal with that.
Can you tell us about the role? Sorry, I was interrupting. Can you tell us about the role your character plays in the government?
He's a trade minister, and because of his experience in the military and dealing with foreigners and understanding more about the mentality and maintaining the Japanese dignity of who they are and not the arrogant sort of army. We're talking about the Navy and intelligence and seeking to have Japan maintain who they are, not being dominated, and figuring out the solution.
Your character's kind of a moral center in the books.
Yeah.
So will that continue into the show, or?
Yeah. That's all this character is about the morality, and it's part of his DNA. It's not anything that you can just change by coming to America. I found that out through my whole life. I tried to change to become more American. It just doesn't feel right. It's like being with a woman in a relationship and somehow it's not what you thought it was going to be. And so, yes, it will continue to be there. And we'll see in what form. I think that's the beauty of this format. It leaves a lot of room to change and grow. Yeah, a lot for different age groups. I think for the millennials, going into the second season, it'll be interesting to see this character change in particular, in that because he's such a moral piece, how through the series it comes to certain conflicts and that will be challenged, and we'll see what his solution is to that. Millennials don't even have a clue what they're headed for. And that's always true when business takes over. That's the danger of business. More than politics and military, it's business. Military and politics are only puppets of business.
It's like business takes over sports stadiums, and business takes over everything, right?
I'm sorry?
You know, like businesses take over sports stadiums now. Right?
Oh, yeah.
Things like that. It is. It's all business.
And now they're into the social media and everything about communication. To me, the last century was about the top businesses were guns and drugs. That's what ran the last century. Kind of sounds like a gang to me. And that's what ultimately happens when you put that kind of two pieces of power together. You're going to end up with a gang. This century is about communications and telecommunications. That's going to be the bigger businesses.
And one of the things that I think happened both in the 1920s with the Teapot scandal and Hearst and all of them, and is happening today with all the telecommunications and news media outlets. It's all about controlling the information and doing the spin on it. And with Man in the High Castle, it's all about controlling the information and the lack of it. And how do you feel about that kind of parody within the show?
Absolutely. And the NSA and eavesdropping and all of that, it's all part of the show. So what we're seeing is fascists, the Nazis and the Japanese, reflecting what democratic institutions we have that are practicing the same kind. So it is relevant.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.